That's classic.
So you can be close to it.
I can tell you this is my first time being recorded, and my first thought was, oh crap, I can't cuss. And then they cleared it, so we're good. So my name's Cinnamon. I am, just an easy rundown, I have a Master's of Arts, a Master's of Social Work. I am a licensed independent social worker with supervisory endorsement, which means that I can train other social workers. And I am a licensed independent chemical dependency counselor with clinical supervision endorsement again. And I'm also a certified clinical trauma professional. So that are most of those things I already had in place, and I didn't know anything about the fire service here in Nashville. I ended up working in Hamilton. I left Columbus in September of 2016, and I had no idea what community I was walking into. It was just the first place to give me a job, and I was moving to Cincinnati. What I didn't know is there had been a line of duty death right after I got there, or right before I got there. So about a year after I'd been on my job, the city of Hamilton came to my organization and said, a year ago, you offered your services and we very rudely shut the door in your face. Like 2 clinicians that actually showed up to the fire station and they said, we got this, and didn't really let them pass the door frame. But now we don't have this. We really don't got this, and we need some help. Do you have anybody? And coming from Columbus, in all transparency, I was an average sized fish in a very big pond. But coming to Hamilton, it worked out that I was a big fish in a small pond, and I was the only trauma professional that they had. But I also didn't know anything about fire service. So I'm like, sure, I'll go meet with these guys. So I meet with the city safety director. And one of the first things that he says is, this is going to be tough. There's a huge stigma. They probably won't want you either, even though they know they need you. But it's not an easy group to get into. And I can say now that I've worked with police officers, you guys are cake. But at that same meeting with Jason Callahan, that was the first day I met him, and I didn't realize that he was basically going to become my partner in crime over time. So that right after we met in September of, I want to say 17, that next month I went in and I did 3 days of training with that department, just like I did you. But it was not nearly as savvy as this because, again, I was a trauma professional. I didn't know anything about fire service. And everyone stayed in the whole entire session except for a crew that got called out. And one guy stormed out, screaming and yelling, and he came back to me later and he's like, it's not personal. And what he was saying was, we have all this mandated training, and then when we really need it, we get shipped out on call. And everyone came back later and they were like, please don't take offense, that's not who us. The rest of it, I'm like, first off, he didn't offend me. He spoke volumes to how badly this is needed, that he was that upset. Because most of the time when people get out of my trainings, like for whatever reason, it's 2 hours that they don't have to sit at the table, right? It's not the kitchen table. So that is kind of how I got into the fire service. 3 days of training, 3 weeks of a murder trial. I say that very intentionally. It was listed as an arson trial, but by the end of it, it flipped to a murder sentencing. And I think that it's really important that we use that word. It was a murder trial. And so for 3 weeks, my responsibility was to focus on the guys. And if they went out, I went out. If they came in, I came in. If they got off the stand, I went back out. They were my sole purpose of being there. And then after that, I want to say very quickly, I was seeing at least 20% of the department for clinical services, so actual therapy. And we have a roster, I want to say 103, 105. At the time it was 105, and I was seeing 20% of the department. So at least 20 guys on top of a regular caseload, because they were not anticipating that. And then within 6 months, I quickly realized, like, one, my agency wanted me to go back to seeing my standard clients, and I didn't want to. And I also learned that they were going to start sourcing my firefighters out to different clinicians, and I didn't want that either. So I quit, and I started Whole House. And so now I have a private practice that I focus, specialize in first responders. And even to go more granular, I specialize in fire service and EMS. So that's kind of how it got started. I know Jason was here a few weeks ago, and he and I, it's always a coincidence, but we tend to come in and out of departments very close together. All right, so today, this is what I came to do. Increase your understanding of post-traumatic stress and its impact on how our body functions, how we think, how we feel, and how we behave. Answering all the questions of like why do I or why does he or she do that, and to increase your ability to reach out for support when you need it and to help your peers. So the only guidelines I have is I will talk for 2 straight hours. I can talk for 6. I've done it before, but it's usually not preferred. I'm going to ask that you take care of yourself. If you got to go pee, go pee. If you get tired and your back starts to hurt, go stand in the back of the room. If you really just need out, go outside. Like, I don't take offense. The community usually gives breaks, right? The other thing is don't take care of me, I'm grown too. So for me, sometimes I'll share a story and it affects me. So if you guys are fixers and problem solvers, I am not a problem to be solved. I am okay. I promise. I take lots of good care of myself. The last thing is if you get triggered by anything I say, again, see rule number 1, but also please let me or somebody else know. I want everybody to leave here whole. I don't want to walk out of here thinking that I gave you all this education and that actually upset somebody. Capiche? We good? Okay. All right, so working definitions that we'll talk about today. Trauma, PTSD, and TRSI. So trauma, we usually don't know what this means. We think we do, but we don't. But all trauma is an overwhelming experience that affects our body and our brain. That's it. Either we haven't experienced it before, or the accumulation of it impacts us, or we just don't know how to cope with it. So the first time I ever got into an accident, a car accident that I was driving, absolutely a trauma. I did not have the coping skills to deal with that because I'd never been in that situation before. You guys are unique, right? Like you train out the yin yang for a lot of things that you may never see in your fire service or in your fire career. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is you'll start to notice like, oh, I can see why we have this cumulative stress issue because exactly what looks like unhealthy is exactly what your job requires. So that trauma is not just an event, it actually leaves an imprint on your body. And it leaves it in your muscles, it leaves it in your brain, and that's where we usually see where things go by and we don't even acknowledge them. It's only when we start to see it in behavior and mood changes that we do. So PTSD. PTSD is typically the only thing that anyone collects any research on, meeting that diagnostic criteria. But in 1980, when PTSD was first put in the DSM, that was the DSM-3, we're on 5 now, and there were 2 versions for 4. They said, do not use for insurance or forensic purposes. So if you come see me and I take your insurance card, guess what they're going to require that I do?
Give you a diagnosis.
Give you a diagnosis straight out of that book. So we have somehow, in those years between 1980 and today, we have lost that same staple that says, do not use this. These are research criteria. It is not supposed to be for what we use it for today. If you're ever in my office, I'll tell you I think the DSM is bullshit. I won't say that here though, but if you're in my office, that's absolutely what I believe, and I'll explain why based on the TRSI piece. So there are 600,000 ways that you could have PTSD. So I could line 600,000 firefighters up, and they all would have the same exact diagnosis, and they would all have a different, like, check boxes that they checked when it comes to symptoms. Because it's such a huge umbrella, and we've done such a poor job being able to, like, not narrow it down, but the reality is that there's so many symptoms that there's only one label for all these symptoms. And it doesn't make a lot of sense because there's a huge portion of first responders that don't even meet the criteria. And PTSD criteria actually isn't that tricky to meet. And we'll go over that a little bit later. So TRSI, this is my word, trauma-related stress injuries. And the reason I came up with it is for a few reasons. One, PTSD doesn't include just compassion fatigue, right? Where I'm from, in Hamilton, we call that Narcan syndrome. That idea that maybe like the first time you saved a life, you took great care. The most recent, and I know you guys don't get a lot of the same kind of clientele that we do a little south of here, but that last time you get an overdose and you throw them the mask and say, put that to your face till we get to the hospital, right? Like you just kind of don't care anymore. You start to lose that same level of compassion. And I've watched it. I've watched it when I've called for my family. I've watched it when I've called with clients. And I've watched it at the kitchen table. And I've watched it on runs when I do ride-alongs. So I know it's there. But it's hard to talk about because the implication is you're doing a bad job. And I don't think that's true. So with TRSI, it acts as an umbrella. It doesn't include, or it includes everything, all the impacts that maybe you're not diagnostically meeting the criteria, right? But it doesn't mean that you haven't had a bad run and it's weighing on you. Like that still counts. Like there's no reason why we can't acknowledge that as an occupational hazard. It also allows us to kind of add to the data. So right now, you guys are having crazy skewed numbers compared to the regular population. But the reality is it's even far greater when we look at how that impact is that doesn't meet criteria. And the third reason is that, one, we need to reshape research, right? Like we have a lot of research, even more is emerging on first responders and PTSD, but who's getting left out when they're not meeting that criteria? And the biggest thing for me, and this kind of came up when I met with Safety Director Stromizi and Jason Cowdy on that first day, and they told me about the stigma. My answer was like, that's okay, I'll go straight for the brain, right? Because when we think of PTSD, we have certain ideas, but the reality is it's an injury. It's an actual TBI. It changes your brain, and I'll talk about that today. Any questions? Edwards, I did not have coffee today, so we're going to go much slower. Yesterday, I
I'm okay with it.
45 minutes early. And still left 10 minutes afterwards, after what I was supposed to be done. All right, so barriers to treatment. Why do people not come see people like me? Well, first responders, let's look around the room. We've got 2 women. One is actually in blues, right? I'm not sure what's going on with you. I should be looking.
Right along.
Right along? Awesome. So the reality is this is a hyper-masculine field that's dominated by men. And we socialize men to think that success equals this, it looks like this. And so this is not a culture where everyone's like saying, you know what, you hurt my feelings. That run was really hard, right? So I talk about we have a Wendy's application that used to get thrown out at people if they came back from a hard run. I heard yesterday after hours, like after we were officially done, that somebody's trainer talked about, I want to say passion bug. Did anybody in the room with us yesterday? So there's always like some little line that people can relate to. If you can't handle this, blank is always hiring, right? So we know that there's like that culture, and stigma is not external. Like we get it. Your job is hard. We don't expect the same things out of you that you expect of yourselves or that you expect of each other. So the firefighters binge drink at nearly twice the rates as the general population. So IAFS Center for Excellence in Maryland has a beautiful facility that also includes a detox center for alcohol. The last time I checked, it hadn't been really used. Because you all know how to stop. Right between like 10 p.m. and midnight, so you don't break the rules to get back on shift the next day. But I've also heard people say, I will mow my lawn at 7 o'clock in the morning to justify cracking open a beer. And they do, like I don't say this joking, I mean it is kind of funny, but the reality is like these are things that I hear in my office. I realized I needed to come see you because I'm mowing my lawn at 7 a.m. just to justify drinking a beer. And you guys actually do meet the criteria for PTSD at twice the rate of the general population. And that doesn't mean that you're weak. It doesn't mean that you're not cut out for this. What it means is we have actually, in our culture, created a job so the rest of us don't have to, right? Like, so I'm from Knox County. Does anybody know where Knox County, the NAS, Mount Vernon, all that is, Kenyon College? Okay, so that's where I'm from. Last November, I went up and trained their fire department, Mount Vernon's fire department, for free because they peeled my 84-year-old uncle off the road with no helmet on his Honda Goldwing trike. He crossed the double yellow line and hit an SUV. Like, they peeled him off the road. 84-year-old thin skin, right? It was a mess. But I didn't have to do that. And neither did my aunt, and neither did my mother, who is a sister. Like, that's why your job exists. So the rest of us don't have to. And if we created a whole entire profession so we don't have to do it, there's a reason that we don't want to do it. So instead of that cumulative trauma being spread, it gets put right onto you. And then there's this culture, like, if you're not cut out for this, go to Fashion Bum, go to Wendy's. I talked about, I have an 18-year-old client who's in EMT school. He's not seeing me about firefighting or medic or anything like that, but I asked him, I said, do you know what you're getting into? And he said, oh yeah, I've done ride-alongs, and I have no problem with blood. I wanted to be a doctor. And he was super condescending in his answer and really naive. And I say this jokingly, but it was kind of serious. I was mixed between wanting to hug him and wanting to throat punch him. Because he was just so arrogant and had no idea what he was getting into. Now, if I ask my guys who have usually been on between 15 and 25 years or are retired, what would you tell your 18-year-old self, your 19-year-old self? And they're like, honestly, Cinnamon, I don't know. I don't know if I'd do this again. Because they're coming to me because the impact has been so great that it's actually caused functional issues. So we know that stigma is there. We know that a lot of times you don't know where to find people like me, right? Like I'll go train a department and they've never heard of firefightermentalhealth.org, which is the OAPFF's mental health website. And you can find all of us, all the peer support. You can find me, you can find clinicians that may be in your area, although this is District 4, right?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, Jason doesn't like to put other people up. He's like, we're good with her. So it's just me, I apologize. A cost. I have guys that want to come see me, but because of insurance, and a lot of times townships and cities' insurance plans are not fabulous, it's still a lot of out-of-pocket expense. And then there's the occupational normalization. Right? Like, you guys are fine. And I kind of describe it like you're all in a little fishbowl with each other. And so if I ask, the guy next to me who rides in the truck, hey, did that bother you? No. Didn't bother me either. Right? But if you join us in the ocean, like, we're like, holy shit, that was awful. How are you okay? But how many of you've noticed how many of you have more than 10 years on? Ian? And how many of you have more than 16 years on? Okay. So the idea that perhaps maybe your circle of friends looks a little bit different today than when you started 10, 15, 16 years ago, heck, even 5 years ago, right? It gets smaller and smaller because other people don't get it, right? Other people don't get it, and so then it's not just when you're at the station, it's when you're outside of the station too. I trained one department, and 2 guys came in afterwards, and they said, will you give us marriage counseling? And I was like, you both need marriage counseling? He's like, no. For the 2 of us, we're best friends, we're coworkers here, we run on the same shift, we run on the same crew, and he works for me in a tree cutting business outside of here. And our wives are starting to hate the other one. So we must not be doing something right that we can get away with our friendship. And I was like, this is what happens. They're literally spending not just 24 together, but then at least another 24 during that 72-hour period. And then aesthetics, going back to that concept of masculinity. Strength through success and control, right? And we have beliefs around what it means to be bothered by a run or have a problem. Feelings of shame and inadequacy, like, the reality is that that's a big deal. It's a big deal, and it makes people not show up for treatment. Trouble identifying and expressing feelings. When the community asks me, Cinema, what can we do for fire service? What can we do to help end the stigma? I'm like, my first response is always, teach your boys how to express their emotions. Give them an emotional vocabulary where they actually have words other than I'm mad. That's the easiest thing. Now, I also can say, maybe donate a weighted blanket or, put money in the boot. But realistically, that's one of our biggest challenges, is I sat in a session, hour-long session, and when I first started seeing this particular guy, he could maybe say 4 sentences that whole entire hour. He couldn't find the words, and he was struggling, and he's been with me for 2 years now. And now he's like a motor mouth. I can't get him to shut up. It's great. But the reality is when he first got to me, he didn't even know how to tell me, because he didn't even know how to wrap it into the English language. He just knew he felt awful all the time. And the last thing is, I got this, right? Just like Hamilton said, we got this. We're self-reliant. The idea of going outside and asking for help, it just doesn't feel natural, right? So, the comparison between PTSD and TRSI, and this is where your handout comes in. And Jason, I took my slides out because Jason stole them, and he went over them with you already. But I want to go over this with you. Hang on, I need my old lady glasses. So PTSD, there's always some folks who will say, oh, not everyone has it. It's actually quite hard to meet the criteria. And I don't know, maybe that's just because of my population, because of Southwest Ohio looking like it's jinxed or something, with line of duty deaths and suicides. But either way, I don't have a problem with my clients meeting the PTSD criteria. So criterion A, that very first one, you're already in, right? So it's direct exposure, like it was happening to you. Indirect exposure, it happens to, in your presence, like you actually witnessed it. Learning that a relative or a close friend was exposed to trauma, right? So I have a lot of non-first responder clients, like moms, who come in and after they found out that their kid's been abused. And they're actually having PTSD symptoms because of finding out what happened to their child. And then that last one, indirect exposure to aversive details of a trauma. That's your day, right? So we talk about why we herded all of this into one occupation, so the rest of us don't have to. We don't have to have that level of exposure to trauma, right? So PTSD is the only diagnosis in the DSM that has an external causal factor, right? So things like personality disorders, mood disorders, anxiety, depression, things like that, it is based on this belief that they have an organic cause, right? So a lot of times you'll hear people talk about antidepressants in terms of like a chemical imbalance, right? Like antidepressants fix a chemical imbalance. Well, I'm not saying that you don't have a chemical imbalance with PTSD, but I certainly can explain it and make it go away. So PTSD is not something you came on with necessarily, but it's definitely something that you can accumulate from something outside of yourself. So criteria B. So like we're already at check. Check. Intrusion symptoms, and only one of these is required, right? So that is unwanted, upsetting memories. That can look as simple as we're sitting at the kitchen table and we're talking about a run that happened today, and I'm sitting there and all of a sudden it makes me think of a run that happened 10 years ago, and I didn't ask for that. I didn't invite that memory in, and now I can't shake it. And it's bothering me, and perhaps maybe I look quiet, I look grumpy, I look irritable. You realize like, oh, she isn't in a mood, don't talk to her. Right? So when we have those unwanted memories creep up on us, or sometimes it can even be like you smell something. I remember walking through a mall several years ago in the perfume department, and I was like, it's my kindergarten teacher. And sure enough, I contacted her daughter on Facebook, and I was like, what perfume does your mom wear? And that was what it was. And I couldn't tell you what it smelled like, I couldn't tell what it was called, but just walking through that perfume counter, that's in this Raleigh, who that was. Our olfactory sense is actually the biggest trigger. So I heard a guy talk about, I want to say we were in North Carolina for a first responder mental health conference, and this guy talked about how him and his family were on vacation, and they were driving down the road, they realized they were stuck in traffic. He got out, or he rolled down the window, and he took a whiff, and he knew exactly what kind of fire it was. And so he jumped out of his car, went and handled it, like was one of the first responders on the scene before any medics or rigs got there. And he got back in the car, and his family was like, he was ready to go, and his family was like, are you serious? Like, what just happened? Can we just take a minute? And he's like, no, I'm fine. But that's how his family, observing him, like, kick it on and switch it off. They just had never seen that before, because most of the time your families aren't riding trucks with you, right? So flashbacks, that's what we typically think of. Flashbacks is the number one reason when people tell me they don't have PTSD, it's because they don't have flashbacks, right? So flashbacks is if we're talking about, and we will, the autonomic nervous system, the flashbacks are going to be all the way on the far end in hyper or hypo freeze. So we've got fight, we've got flight, and we've got freeze. The only time we're ever going to move into freeze is when we're either restrained because we can't fight, right? Either literally or proverbially, or we're held captive and we can't flee. And then we'll play Cincinnati Lizard. And that just means that you stop, you freeze, you don't move, and we're working straight off lizard brain, and there is no convincing you. If you're dissociated, I can't tap on your shoulder and say, Ball, hey, you there? Like, you're gone. Just gone. Momentarily, at least. I actually was doing exposure therapy with one of my guys. He was a military firefighter. And he was placed as a military firefighter because he was in Black Hawk Down, the movie. He was one of the guys there. So our therapeutic goal was that he could watch that movie. We never got there. But we were at a restaurant in Hamilton, and the objective was to sit at the front of the restaurant with his back to the door. And we were doing so good. And then all of a sudden, a big white conversion van pulled out front and just parked. And I was like, and he was gone. He was gone. He was back in the Middle East for a good, 2 minutes. And he was trembling. Now, no burqa, nothing, just as white as I could be. But in that moment, that is not who he was seeing. And it was just because that fan pulled out front, right? And that's not even what we were working, we weren't even working on that kind of exposure. That was like a double whammy. So avoidance symptoms, this is really easy. I don't want to talk about it, I don't want to feel it, I don't want to think about it, and I don't want to drive by it, right? So our line of duty death happened on Pater Avenue. And I have some guys that will avoid that area at all costs. And then I have other guys that will intentionally drive by that on the regular, just to grind it in, right? Like that never forget mentality. And I can't say either one is actually healthier than the other, but I do know that avoiding it is a symptom of PTSD. So if you guys start having a conversation at the kitchen table, and maybe you're talking about an old run, and this happens a lot, at least when I'm at the kitchen table, is somebody will bring up something, and it could have happened 10 years ago, it doesn't matter, and there's always going to be someone that gets up and goes into the bunks. They don't want to hear about it, they don't want to talk about it, they don't want to be around it. But then what happens is that they're in their bunk the rest of the day, they don't want to be talked to, they don't come out, they don't converse, and you just know, don't bother them. And that's when we have the negative alterations in cognition and mood. That we're literally just upon hearing about something that we can easily shift into a different kind of mood, right? Even last night, after I left here, I went to Hamilton and I hit 3 stations, the 5s, the 2s, and the 6s. And when I left the 2s, and I'm driving home, actually, I left Callahan last, I realized that one of my guys who usually sits at the kitchen table when I'm there, he was at another desk. Now he's a medic, I knew he was doing a report, but it just seemed fishy because he knows I'm not there all night, right? So I called him on my way home, and I'm like, are you okay? And he's like, yeah, why? Well, I had brought something up that when I got over to the 5s, they're like, you mentioned that in front of him, well, we talk about it all the time. But I didn't think about the fact that we were in front of people that would have thought the same way that that guy thought. Like, you mentioned that in front of him. And so I called to check on him, and he started laughing. He's like, no, listen, man, I really just needed to finish my report. But those are the things that I pay attention to. I've asked one guy, I'm like, hey, are you doing okay? Because he was just quiet at the kitchen table. Like, I left the station, and within minutes, he blew up my phone. I was like, I'm really okay. You think I'm not okay? Are you concerned about me? Do I look not fine? And I was like, dude, I was just saying, how are you today? But that idea of that change in the cognition and mood. So sometimes it can look like inability to recall key features of the trauma. So during our trial, one of a lieutenant at the time, but a captain today, was on the stand, and the defense attorney asked him a question about who opened the door, was the door locked, how he got in, who got in first. And his answer was, I went in first, and the door was unlocked. Well, that turned into a black hole, or a rabbit hole that they just went down. And they had to have two more people come in and testify. One was our investigator, and the other one was the actual guy who put the fist through the door, reached in, and unlocked it to like counter what this then lieutenant said during his testimony. And he just didn't remember. Like, the only thing that he remembered was that he opened the door. He didn't remember the rest of it. Guess what? Because it wasn't necessary. Because after he opened that door, he also pulled one of his friend's dead bodies out of a basement. So not everything was worthy of, being collected into your long-term memory. And he ran into that defense attorney later, and he said, man, that really fucked with me. What you did, that bothered me for a long time. And the defense attorney's answer was, sorry, man, I was grabbing at straws. We didn't have a case. It's not personal. And that defense attorney wasn't really loved to begin with. But during the middle of a firefighter murder trial, you call a firefighter a liar? Definitely not loved anymore right now. So we know that people don't always remember. We know that that overly negative thoughts, right? So we'll talk about that in a minute, that catastrophication. But the idea that the world, you, and others are just like that, when I see memes or people say things like, you can't trust people, or, there aren't any good people out there. To me, that's exactly what that is. It's a change in worldview and how we see ourselves in it and other people. Exaggerated blame of self or others. So, this recording makes me nervous. So one of the things that I worked on with clients is, right, so we had a line of duty death, and it happened December 28th, 2015. But in 2013, there were negotiations, and the city's budget was up in arms, just like everybody else's fire budget was, and there were a lot of cuts. And it included, we lost the Sevens, which was the station that was closest to 5 Points, which is where Pater Avenue is. So 2013, we had a chief. I know that chief not well. He retired shortly after I joined the department, and he, but you could just see the weight on him after Patrick died. But if you ask certain clients of mine who caused Patrick's death, they go right by the two men that are sitting in prison right now. And they'll go straight to the city of Hamilton and Chief Dawson. Because if Chief Dawson would have advocated for us, if the city wouldn't have been so greedy, then we would have had money, the Sevens wouldn't have closed, they wouldn't have had such a long arrival time, and Patrick would be alive today. Now that's a whole lot of construction right there, right? Like that's like several degrees of separation. But that's what I was working with. That's what they thought. If Chief Dawson had went to bat, if the city hadn't been greedy, therefore Patrick would be alive today. There was no alternative to that for them, right? Not like, hey, maybe two guys could have fallen in the hole. Or maybe it wouldn't have been Patrick. Maybe it would have been somebody else, right? Like the idea that it was just going to go well if this thing that happened 2 years before would have went differently. So they blamed not only the wrong people, but ultimately all the way back 2 years. Negative emotional state. So then we start going back to very, what we call mammalian feelings, and that's that anger, fear, guilt, shame, right? So that pops up a lot. I get phone calls a lot when that sinks in, right? Or text messages, hey Cinnamon, are you busy? Can you call me? Because they're just weighted down with that. I took one today already. Decreased interest in participation in activities. So that is a classic depression symptom. And so when people ask me, like, do you have an expertise in depression or anxiety? And I'm like, PTSD is like this big old Venn diagram. And intermittent explosive disorder, major depressive disorder, anxiety, borderline personality, they all fall in that somehow. They all have overlapping symptoms. But the lack of interest or participation in, right? So you can go and just not want to go, and that still counts, right? I see that a lot where my guys will pick fights with their wives so they don't have to go to like a sporting event with their kids, and then they have already prepared their apology for when their wives get home. They're just picking a fight so they don't have to go because they know she'll storm out and do it herself, and then they can crack their beer and sit in their lazy boy and zone out in front of the TV, but they already have the apology prepared for when she comes back. Because they weren't really that mad, they just want it out. I'm going to assume none of you do that though. And difficulty feeling positive emotions, right? Like I have one client that I work with is a dispatcher, and their thing is, I would love to get a present and not have to fake it. My feelings get really hurt if I don't get the gift on whatever day, holiday that is, but I feel like I'm pretending every time I get a gift. Like, it's just like this, oh, she can't get over. Criterion E, alterations in arousal and reactivity. So, irritability and aggression. That is like the biggest red flag in first responders is when I did a survey of wives, and 75% of them said, I've noticed over the course of his career, my spouse has a shorter fuse. He's more explosive, he gets angrier faster, and his anger is disproportionate to what event occurred. So that can look like my 4-year-old did something that upset me or was, not appropriate, but my reaction and disciplining is like a 10 compared to their 4. Like whatever they did, my reaction is over the top. And I actually had a client tell me that his 4-year-old daughter said, Daddy, you can't talk to me like that. I'm just a kid. And then he called me. Because that was the trigger for him to be like, oh shit, I need to go see someone. Risky or self-destructive behavior. We talked a little bit about this when we were just kind of hanging out yesterday. But infidelity is a huge, high-risk, self-sabotaging behavior that people engage in. And I've had a lot of people who come in and say, I want a divorce, and then we treat some of the PTSD, no they don't. And now part of my job in helping them fix those wounds, right, with spouses. And some we save and some we don't, right, those marriages. But the drinking, after Pat died, one of his friends who's not with Hamilton, was showing up at work drunk, driving an engine drunk, all kinds of things because just didn't care anymore, right? Hypervigilance. So the ironic thing about this is that in the fire service it looks like wisdom. Hypervigilance looks like wisdom, and this is what differentiates it. Hypervigilance is a symptom that causes significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other areas of important functioning. But wisdom doesn't. Wisdom doesn't impair you. But I've seen a lot of people who are so tired of toxicity in the department think that they're helping a younger guy out and they're spewing toxicity, right? Like, I saw so-and-so be nice to you, just so you know he's a dick. Don't fall for it. Right? Like that kind of stuff, that hypervigilance. It's not just like that guy who didn't want to, he kept his back to the door as part of his exposure therapy. It can literally be just as like, I'm passing my wisdom on. Oh, there's a memo coming down Friday. We've seen enough of those memos that we know what they look like. more overtime, less staffing, we didn't get funding for this, we aren't gonna get this kind of gear that we need, we're gonna wait till we can see if we can get a grant. Like, all those things, like, it could be Monday, they find out that something's coming down the pipe, and they got 4 solid days where they are just over it. And Friday, guess what? It could likely be not something that they wanted to hear, but they have added 4 days to their misery, because guess what? They were already gonna be miserable on Friday. But that hypervigilance, like, increases their own suffering. And then, that exaggerated startle reflex. It's a big one because in that moment, your body actually thinks it's going to die, right? So if you've ever seen somebody get startled and like jump, I was actually outside of a church once, and somebody that I'm sure they would call themselves my friend. This is not what friends do, but he didn't know better. He hid behind the door, and so when I went to open it, he jumps out. And like, before he could even blink his eye, I was on the ground on my stomach. I just went down. And there was a Vietnam vet at the corner of the church that watched me. And I like got back up, and my friend was like apologizing, and he felt so bad. I wasn't embarrassed. I'm used to it. I have an exaggerated startle reflex. I've done it in a Lazy Boy in a firehouse during a scary movie. But he felt really bad. But when that older gentleman came up and he goes, I saw that. I said, you did? He goes, I know what that is. I said, okay. And that was the end of it. But something where somebody was just being friendly, playing a little game, and before I could even think, I was flat on my stomach. Because that's where that's that exaggerated startle reflex. We think we're going to die in that moment. Difficulty with concentration and difficulty with sleep. So when it comes to sleep, you guys are already behind the 8 ball, right? So your jobs require you, at a bare minimum, to alternate your sleeping conditions, right? And sleep is one of the most important, stable, like fundamental things when it comes to mental health, because of all the things that we'll talk about in terms of your brain. But in reality, like, you guys are all, like, this is one of the problems that I hear a lot with other therapists, is the guys say, well, my therapist told me that if I don't quit my job, I can't get well. And I was like, you want to quit your job? And they're like, no. And I was like, were you going to go back? And they're like, no. And I'm like, well, then that wasn't a useful thing to say. Right? Most people aren't going to quit their job because they need to get better sleep. Right? Because everyone around them is doing the same thing. That lack of sleep, that back and forth, 24, 72 hours between shifts. If you're lucky enough to actually get to go home for 48 hours, we'll talk about later what y'all decide to do in those 48 hours, like second or third or fourth jobs. But ultimately, if you're not sleeping, if you're not getting to sleep, if you're not staying asleep, and if you're still groggy in the morning, there's a problem, right? So your brain is actually resetting and restoring overnight, and it's essential to your mental health. And if you're not getting good sleep, then you're going to have some unstable mental health. And nothing has to happen for that. Because what do they say, like a sleepy impaired driver is more dangerous than a drunk driver? And then the last 3 are super easy. Has to be longer than a month. I have never, ever, well, okay, no, that's not true, once. One time, I've had a client come to me within the first 30 days of a critical incident that they were upset about. That's it. But you know what, that client's cup tipped over with that one because of something that happened 11 years ago. They had never got treated for it. So one time in my time of doing this. So Jason will say, and he may have even said here, firefighters need 45 days. We may be okay after 45, but then 45 gets to be our cutoff. But the reality is diagnostically, if it's happening longer than 30 days, then it meets the criteria. And most of the time, I'm seeing people long after the first 30 days after a critical incident. The second, or the criteria G, just to say it again, clinical distress. If it's causing problems at home, if it's causing problems at work. Now, I talked about this a little bit yesterday. I had an entire department have me come in for 3 days of training, 6 hours each day, because they had one guy that nobody wanted to tell he was an asshole. Even the chief didn't want to tell the guy that he was an asshole. And so they brought me in. And I was like, make sure he's in the room. And that's how we handled it. But the reality is that it was causing problems at work. Guy lost a family member to cancer, lost a child to a childhood illness, had probably 20 to 25 years on service, and he was not doing well, but he was showing up like a dick. Nobody wanted to be around him anymore. And so they bring me in because nobody wanted to say anything and make it worse. And then not attributable to physiological effects of substance or another medical condition. So if the binge drinking started as a result of this, now I've had other people come and say, hey Cinnamon, we've got a guy that's having all these things and we're really concerned about him. And I'll see him, but then it's not always this. Sometimes the drinking comes first or the drinking comes second as a result of this. I've sent people off to rehab only to find out like maybe they're not an alcoholic, but maybe their drinking is part of the avoidance behaviors and the self-sabotage. But now when they reach for a beer, they know exactly why they're doing it and they don't anymore. You don't have to be an alcoholic to not drink. You just have to be somebody that figures out it's not productive. So that is your PTSD criteria. So what does TRSI do? We actually say it's not abnormal. It's not a disorder. It's an injury. And we are built for this, right? So we have an autonomic nervous system. We've got sympathetic and parasympathetic system, right? For me, I get into a car accident, I shift into sympathetic nervous system, right? That fight or flight. That's how my body handles stress. But then guess what? The car accident's over, maybe the police leave, maybe all the medics leave, and I'm okay. But you guys, guess what? You are the medics. This is constant for you. So even your threshold, your homeostasis is actually changed. So when you're like, it's another run. And I've been sitting at a table and the siren's gone off and we were in the middle of a conversation. You're like, you want to go with us? So we can just finish the conversation? It's just that like mundane. But the reality is I've also had guys in my office and they jumped out of their seat when my phones went off because my phone had the same ringtone as their dispatch in their station. So out of context, out of the seat. In context, just mosey. You guys have a different threshold, right? So that tells me when you're at work, you are constantly in sympathetic response, right? Sympathetic dominance. So if we know that your brain is having a natural reaction and to experiences that are abnormal, right? Like we're built to be able to handle stress, but then we're supposed to be able to come down. But your job is literally created so we don't have to do it. So that tells me if we're trying to avoid it as community members to the point that, we give you like, a building and trucks and uniforms just so we don't have to do it, then it becomes abnormal, right? Just like those guys that pulled my uncle off the road. That's not normal. That's not normal to have that kind of exposure. It's just not. And there was a guy that was in my training when I talked about why I was there that day, and he got a look on his face, and he ended up going on a run, and he didn't come back. I didn't see him the rest of the day. But he goes, how do you know him? And he looked mad. And before I could say that was my uncle, he was going on a run. But he was so distressed because he was on that run, and he did know my uncle. And I had another guy that actually scheduled the training, and he's like, man, I know that guy. I'm real good friends from high school from his grandson. We used to hang out with him all the time. And I said, I'm sorry for your loss. Did you go on that run? He goes, no, I didn't, and thank goodness, because I wouldn't be as good as I am today with it. Right? Like that kind of exposure. So research confirms that we have an imperative for safety deeply wired into our minds and bodies. That autonomic nervous system mediates safety, trust, and intimacy through the subsystem called the social engagement center. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Trauma may be distinct and long-lasting effects can even develop in people who don't have PTSD, right? So maybe you don't meet the criteria. Maybe you aren't one of those 600,000 people in a row. But that doesn't mean that if something bad doesn't happen, it doesn't shape-shift you, right? It leaves a lasting impact. And we kind of already talked about this. It told us in the landmark 1980 DSM-3, first acknowledging PTSD, that it was appropriately modest and acknowledged that this is a diagnostic system that was imprecise. So the idea that there's 600,000 ways to have PTSD, there's something a little wrong with that, right? That you could have two guys that look completely different. and they have the same disorder. And so if somebody starts to understand, oh yeah, if they're having flashbacks, and they're dissociating and they're in a rage, that's PTSD. But this guy over here that all of a sudden turns into a party boy like Callahan did during Rumspringa, not everyone caught on to that right away. It took a while before they were like, hey, Baptist boy, rein it in. Something's wrong, right? So, masculinity and mental health. This is a male-dominated field. And I'll say this, again, the recording. So when I was sitting at a kitchen table with a group of the guys, and they were talking about some EAP staff that had come in and done a training. And there was two women, and they were not talking pleasantly about them. And I was like, did y'all talk about me like this when I'm not here? And they're like, no, Cinnamon, you had us a pussy. And the reason they said that is because the very first day I trained, Callahan sat about right there, and he kept counting how many times I said that word. Because ultimately what it was coming down to was nobody wanted to acknowledge that they were having a hard time because that Wendy's application because it made them look like a pussy. And nobody wanted to be a pussy. And so now I have clients that'll say, he's a ball sack. You know, because pussies are actually tough and ball sacks are tender. So we don't use that word anymore, Cinnamon. And I'm like, even the small things make a difference. But the reality is that you have female firefighters working for you. At least one. And one on the line. And I don't know if you guys know this, but pussy is anatomically actually a vagina. And they belong to women. And so you're literally saying, I don't want to be her. And if you think your bar for being tough is high, she won't even tell you how high it is. So if she cracks, it's going to be way worse for her. Losing respect and having people being concerned about whether or not she's capable to do the job. And normally, women don't sit this close. They usually have to sit in the back, and they're going, yay. I'm so glad I'm not on camera. But the reality is this is a male-dominated culture, and it's hyper-masculine, right? We label you guys as heroes. The reality is part of the reason I do this when I talk about neuropsychology is because it has nothing to do with your character, your moral code. It has nothing to do with your capacity to be tough. It is an injury. Anybody know somebody or actually has been out like for a knee or a shoulder? Yeah. Would somebody say, well, and you probably do, right? Like you sucker punch each other and you say toughen up or whatever. But the reality is this is nothing different than that, except I'm the PT. I'm the physical therapist for this kind of injury. So common statements that I hear in therapy. I'm not getting on meds. I'm like, okay, great, I don't prescribe them. It's not my scope of practice. I'd rather they think I'm an asshole. And I see a lot of cops going to prison where they think they'd rather be thought that they were assholes than deal with mental health issues. It's not like I'm going to kill myself, because that's our bar. As long as I'm not suicidal, I'm fine. But I read an article either yesterday morning before I came or the day before, and it said in a very short span, I want to say it was like the 12 months, there were 15,000 suicides in the state of Ohio. And that's just what was actually listed as a suicide on the death certificate. Because we know firefighters, and it lists untimely, unexpected, and accidental. Very rarely do we talk about when it actually is suicide. And we have a high rate of suicide in the fire service. They won't trust me anymore in the line of duty. My thing with that is, they will if you get treatment. But if you dissociate in the middle of a run, then that's when they're not going to trust you. Well, it takes your duty. I don't even understand what's happening with me, so what? How will they? Like, how do I explain it to somebody? Well, again, it goes back to that cultural change. I knew what I was signing up for, that 18-year-old boy who thinks he knows what he's signing up for. But did any of you really, that's kind of like going to the dentist, right? When the dentist is like, it's going to hurt, and you're like, okay. And then they start drilling, and you're like, holy shit, I didn't know it was going to hurt like that. And I don't think that even a large number of ride-alongs is going to change what you feel like you know going in and what it feels like 5, 10, 15, 25 years in. And then the last one, they'll think I'm a pussy. So the graphic that I have to go with this, because this is exactly what I think of when I visualize this, is that scene in Grease. Who's seen Grease? Yeah? When John Travolta's character asks Nikki to ride along, and he gets all emotional and they start hugging and it gets a little too intimate, so they whip out their phones out of their back pocket, right? That avoidance of anyone questioning their masculinity. So, this is the path that I went down with the fire service, because this is a lot easier than talking about feelings and behaviors. So neuropsychology, what is happening in our brain? We know that trauma compromises the brain area that communicates the physical, embodied feeling of being alive. And we know now that they're talking about clients with PTSD. Their behaviors are not a result of moral failings or signs of lack of willpower or bad character. They're caused by actual changes in the brain. And that's from Bessel van der Kolk, who's like the guru of trauma. So, basic brain system, right? So we have the reptilian brain, that brain stem. Instinctual respiration, heart, blood pressure, things that we can't necessarily control unless we're bringing it down, like intentionally bringing it down. I can't just go, I'd like my blood pressure to lower, and it works. Or we use medication for it, right? Limbic systems, now we're in the mammalian part of our brain. And I'll talk a little bit about exactly what's there, but that's our emotional brain, that's our fight and our flight, and that's those basic emotions, the fear, anger, hate, hurt, and rage. And then we have the human part of the brain, and that's the cortex. The prefrontal cortex is where I spend a lot of my time focusing on, but that's where the rational, logical, creative part of our brain centers, that executive functioning, all of that. And that's where our belief systems are. So let's say you believe something is wrong, but then there's a trauma in the midst of it, and all of a sudden that's gone. So Jason is a great example of how your belief systems get chucked, because this is what happens. You have an underactive prefrontal cortex. So when I teach things to clients, I'm very careful about what we call cognitive behavioral therapy, because I had one client came back in and beating themselves up. They're like, I don't know what happened. I knew better. I knew better, and I just didn't do better. And I'm so disappointed in myself. And I was like, this is not the right way to go. Because I knew it's because everything that we taught them, or everything that we had covered in therapy, was up here. Maybe not everything, but was here. And so when they were triggered, that was simply not available. It's almost like the lights go off, right? Because your amygdala, that fear center, becomes overactive. And after there's been a trauma, first off, it's outside of our conscious control. I can't I can flex my arm, right? I can't flex my amygdala. Can't touch it, can't do anything to it, it's just there. So we have an overactive fear center. And Bessel van der Kolk calls it the smoke alarm, because its main job is to detect danger, right? Like, we are very cavemanish in the sense that we are built for survival. And so our brains like to create stories. I'm safe, I'm not safe. If I'm not safe, then I need to be alert and I need to plan, right? So when we have an overactive amygdala after trauma exposure or cumulative stress of adversive details of traumatic events, then we have an overactive amygdala. And so that's like that guy who walks in the room and it gets silent, and y'all were just like, stop talking because somebody walked in the room, and you all looked, and they're like, what? You talking about me? What? Right? That is from an overactive amygdala. And that's when your social engagement system registers personal offense and personalization. So that amygdala is going to find all of the things that could possibly put them in danger. And I've even noticed in me, right? My first thought, if my partner doesn't answer his phone or comes home a little bit later than I expected, I know what you all see now. And my brain automatically goes to, oh shit, heart attack while driving, car accident, what's going wrong, right? And I don't even do your job. I just care about your job. So that overactive fear center is absolutely real. So then we've got an underactive hippocampus, which is your memory center. So when we talk about like nightmares or intrusive memories, so if you think about your brain, like your brain collects all this information over the course of the day, and it kind of like is supposed to upload and then back download into your long-term memory, right? Well, there is a scientific belief that during sleep, during REM, right, every organ gets about 2 hours to like recoup and repair during a 24-hour cycle. During REM sleep, it's a very small window, and that's the only time that we actually drop out or bottom out in adrenaline. It's the only time our bodies have some level of adrenaline. And so that allows me during REM to process those memories and take the edges off. So instead of looking like, oh my gosh, I got into this car accident, I wasn't paying attention and I slammed into the back of this guy, and then he got out and he was so big and bald and looked angry and he was coming at me, and then all of a sudden I hear the sirens and I realize I'm bleeding but I don't know where blood is coming from, right? Like that's what it looks like with adrenaline. But during REM, it looks like I did not stop my car in time. I hit the car in front of me. A medic came on scene. We were treated. I had an injury. We were released. And that's how we download memories into our long-term memory, and how we inadvertently don't usually have flashbacks and those intrusive memories. But if we are constantly full of adrenaline, I don't know, maybe because every 72 hours you're getting up at, in the wee hours of the morning and you're not able to get quality sleep, it's not downloading properly. The other part that's important is your insula. It's dysregulated, which is what we call the interoception center. And all interoception is my ability to understand where I am in time and space, and my ability to understand what's happening inside my body. Right? So dissociation, all of a sudden I don't know where I am. My balance, sometimes, you start to see people sway when they are about to pass out. The other piece is when I ask clients, they come in for the first time, or any time after that, and they tell me about a critical incident that they're there for, and I ask them to close their eyes, and I'm like, tell me where you feel it. The only answer I ever get is everywhere. Because they don't know. It's just everywhere. But after some work, they'll be like, it's in my jaw, I can feel my heart pounding, feels like there's somebody sitting on my chest, my ankles and my wrists are aching, my legs are trembling. Like they can actually tell me because they've regulated their insula and they're able to tell me what's actually happening in their body. They're not just throwing that blanket on it that says everywhere. And they're not lying that first time. To them, that's exactly what they feel. It's everywhere. I kind of describe it as the Boston Marathon running through your veins. It's just like jitter. And then we have an underactive self-regulation center, your cingulate, which is part of your cortex. And what that is actually going to do is it allows us to not come at our 4-year-old at a 10 when they really only deserve a 5. Right? It allows us to not explode on people when it's regulated. Like that you can upset me and I can calmly react. That I can walk into a room where you all are laughing and then you stop and be able to not scream and shout and take it personally. Right? That somebody can do something and I don't overreact. That's what's happening in your cingulate cortex. So does that make sense? Do you see how, and one of the longer term is that the hippocampus actually shrinks. Somebody asked me, they're like, can we grow it back? Like, can we make it big again? And the answer is, some people say yes and some people say no. Once it's shrunk, sometimes it's just shrunk. So that's why we have to do other things. Just like once you have a shoulder injury, it's not going to work the same way that it worked before. Doesn't mean that it won't work. It just means it won't look the same and it won't feel the same. So that all that aside, here are some other things that are important. Trauma renders us speechless. We don't have words. We can't formulate the sentences because the part of our brain that works on linguistics actually shuts down or becomes underactive. The Brodmann's area 19 is our visual cortex center. During a trauma trigger or a trauma, we actually, our visual cortex allows us to believe that we're somewhere else. So that's part of dissociation. That's part of why my guy saw that white van and he was back in the war, right? The analytical aspect remembers facts statistics, vocabulary events, and all that shuts down during trauma. So right now, if this building started getting shelled, or bullets or bombing or whatever, we would all just hightail it out of here. And we could be standing in the parking lot, and we'd be like, how do we get out of here? Who decided? Who went first? We don't remember. Just like my captain didn't remember that that door wasn't unlocked. We just don't remember everything. But think about it. If I have a bear coming at me, and I'm a caveman, this is all caveman brain. If I have a bear coming at me, my brain is literally going to register its beady little eyes, its pretty little nose, what its whiskers look like, all of those features. So as a human, when I run into a bear later, I don't even have to take that split second to decide if that's a danger. Right? Like that's what my brain is built to do, to detect danger. But then maybe I go to the zoo, and there's glass between me and that cute little bear. And you cannot convince me to get close. It doesn't matter. You're like, Cinnamon, there's glass. They can't get to you. It doesn't matter. I'm like, no thanks. Because that's what my brain is built to do. My brain doesn't care. Cavemen didn't have glass. Didn't care. We're literally only going to remember the things that will keep us safe later. But during that, I'm not going to remember the exact pain. Just like I'll go back to the dentist. And then they hurt me. And I'll still go back because it didn't stay in my brain the same way the visual of a bear will. So we have an activated right brain. So that's where it stores memories of sound, touch, smell, and emotions. Just like that firefighter knew on the side of the road exactly what kind of fire that was based on the smell of the smoke. Right? And you know what I'm talking about, right? Like you guys know from the smell of the smoke, you know which kind of fire it is. Just like I knew that was Mrs. Rowley's perfume in that department store. Just olfactory triggers are the most powerful, and they hit us out of nowhere. But if you think about it, they go in our nose. Guess where it's right behind our nose? That amygdala. Like right behind our olfactory senses is the amygdala, that fear center. So that's why I do a lot with psychoaromacology, because I can make something happen faster than a pill. If I can get somebody to smell something, I can get a response faster than a pill. It automatically reacts to voices, facial features, and gestures and places experienced in the past. That's my bear, right? I'm going to have a visceral, physiological response to that bear. And it's outside my control in that moment. And without the left brain to mitigate, right, so it's deactivated, that linguistic, sequential, and analytical, where that captain would have been able to say, yes, we approached the back porch. The other guy threw his fist through it, reached in, unlocked the door, and then I opened it, right? Like that was deactivated. So all he knew was, I don't remember the door being locked, I just opened it. That's what happened there. And then the activated brain is that, are all the ways that we get triggered. So, physiological response. What's actually happening in your body? Again, I will inundate you with information so we can get away from this characterization that this is a moral failing or a lack of strength or willpower. So when we stifle or subdue that natural play out of trauma in the body, the incomplete responses, now frozen in our nervous systems, are like ticking time bombs primed to go off with aroused force. Right? So until humans find appropriate tools and support necessary to dismantle this force, we'll continue to have unexplained blow-ups. Anybody see somebody have an unexplained blow-up while at work? Ever? Anyone? Yeah. So and we have colloquialisms in our language, right? Like we talk about these things. So never let them see you sweat, right? Hurt me once, shame on you. Hurt me twice, shame on me. Right? All these things that we like say along those lines that are actually very counter to what looks like health. So if I see a tiger chasing a gazelle and the gazelle gets away, you're going to see the gazelle go like this, right? Shake it off. I used to see my dog do this all the time, and I thought I needed to comfort her. I didn't realize what she was doing. But in reality, that gazelle shakes it off and goes on. It doesn't go find the other gazelle and say, oh, Betty, you will not believe what I just got myself out of. It was this close. They don't do that, right? Like they're okay. They shake it off. But what do? I'm fine. I'm fine. I hate that word. The F word. But what we're ending up doing is when we do this, a lot of times what we're not doing and how we protect ourselves so you don't see me shake is that I'll do this. But in reality, I want you to shake. I want you to shake it out. I don't want that stuck in your body. And I have clients that'll come and they're like, I'm so sorry, my mom hates when I do this, and their leg will shake. And I'm like, that's okay, this is the place to do it. So we actually have PL, is Peter Levine, and he does somatic experiencing, and he has created an intervention that actually takes that stress out of your body. But these are the systems that actually are effective, right? And moral belief system, not up there, right? So it's your nervous system. We've talked about that. When we end up in sympathetic dominance because we've had constant exposure to trauma, or we've had one exposure to trauma. Our musculoskeletal system, if I'm bracing, if I know that you're going to hit me, and somebody was like, what, run, or I'd hit you first. And I was like, okay, you're missing the point. But if I think you're going to hit me, I'm going to brace, right? I'm going to tighten up my muscles, because if you hit my hard muscle, it's going to hurt less than if you like hit my flimsy muscle, right? But what ends up happening is we brace all the time because we're always stressed out. So we get headaches, and we get chronic neck and shoulder pain, or we get lower back pain. We're just uncomfortable in our skin because we're constantly bracing. And this also is a handout, because that would have been way too many slides. So our respiratory system, you guys know this, you've seen people hyperventilate. When you get anxious or stressed out or start to have a panic attack, your breath gets shallow and rapid, right? Do we know why that does that? Because we're in sympathetic dominance, and we're revving up for a fight. My breath gets shallow, my heart, I start breathing faster, I pump more oxygen to my heart, which gives me more energy to my arms and my legs to run and to fight. That's it. It's what it's doing. And what else happens is, and we'll talk about that, I'll just kind of skipping ahead to the gastrointestinal system. It's kind of like Popeye, like, you know how it always kicks out and you see all the spinach go to every extremity? Well, what doesn't happen is we don't actually need energy in the middle of a bear fight to digest our lunch. That seems like a waste, right? Like, let's digest lunch after the stress is gone, after the bear attack is over. But if you're constantly exposed to bear attacks, that's when we start to see weight gain, right? And that's when we start to see, if you've ever been up late and you see those cortisol, like pills, that weight loss pills, they're literally targeting that belly fat caused by stress because your constant flood of cortisol. Cardiovascular system, hit that on the heart, right? But over time, you have that kind of strain on your heart, and it's going to cause problems. It's going to cause heart weakening. It's going to cause high blood pressure. Reproductive system. I am definitely not talking, we'll talk about this differently than being imported. So reproductive system, it actually takes a toll, and I think it's on your handout. Male, excess cortisol can affect normal functioning. They politely say it in a way that I don't always master. Chronic stress can affect testosterone production, sperm production, and maturation, and cause erectile dysfunction or impotence. That's kind of like a calling card right there. Like, if nothing else, get treatment for that. For women, absent or irregular menstrual cycles, more painful periods, and changes in lengths of cycles, increased symptoms, cramping, bloating, negative mood, and mood swings, hot flashes prior to menstruation and menopause. Here's the other thing that I've learned, is that when you don't take care of your stress and you go home, it exacerbates your wife's and partner's stress level. And so now you're going to deal with that because they're not able to manage their stress because they can't manage you. You're not manageable. Nobody else can step in and manage you. I call wives the fourth alarm. If a wife speaks up, go get help because they stay quiet. They watch, they observe, they speculate, they give you space, they want you to take your own time getting what you need, but the first time your wife or spouse says, honey, I think you need help, or honey, you need help or we're getting a divorce, do not walk, run. Gastrointestinal system. First off, and I'll kind of explain this when we talk about the vagus nerve, but literally when people are constipated, when they're with diarrhea, I have been on trucks where they just like have Tums and those, little dissolvable treats, whatever. that are just sitting there because they have indigestion, all of those things. I've seen, I'm getting ready to run a support group for chronic illness and PTSD, and it's because they go together, and sometimes we don't know what's the chicken and what's the egg. IBS is a big one, because that's just an umbrella statement because I can't figure out exactly what's wrong. And then your endocrine system is important because that's what's shooting out all the stress hormones into your body all the time. And so hang on, I'm going to skip, I needed to reverse that order. So stress hormones, what is actually happening in your body, it looks like a scene of a working fire, right? Like certain trucks and rigs and the medic arrive in a certain order based on what they're supposed to do, and they leave in a certain order based on their job being done. That's what stress hormones do. So there's a 32 chemical cocktail that gets shot into your body every time you have a stressful event. And when I mean a stressful event, I don't mean like I got into a car accident. I mean I looked up from my phone and saw that I was about to rear end a car. There's one. I made contact with the car in front of me. There's two. The big burly bald guy got out and looked really angry. There's three. I hear the sirens and maybe I don't know the difference between police and a medic and I'm scared. There's four. I realize that I'm bleeding. There's five. Right? So 5 shots just, and I haven't even gotten out of the car yet, of that 32 chemical stress cocktail. And it takes our bodies 12 to 30 hours to actually metabolize that. So how many of you in the last 30 days have worked 2 shifts in a row? Okay. So there's a good chance, I'm going to assume maybe you got 24 off and then came back. Is that about right? Or maybe you worked part-time somewhere else. Or maybe you helped a friend rehab their kitchen. Or you own a truck and you're the guy that all your family and friends call when they need to move shit. Right? How many of you actually sleep and do nothing but rest, no childcare, no laundry, no second job on those 48 hours that you're off? If you were off for 48 hours. This guy? Well, you're like, he just like turned 17, right?
Yeah. He's 21.
I'm 22. 22.
Like he just turned 22.
Yes.
You may not have gotten to know. So the reality is that you guys are usually running on stress hormones that haven't even gotten out of your body before another set comes. So asking for you to recognize is this problematic when this is just the nature of your job, you're like, well, of course. I'm like, yeah, well, your job is not typical, right? Like the rest of us are not scraping bodies off the road or putting heads back together, or not. Or responding to gunshot wounds where little kids' chests are blown out. Or a brother didn't die. Or a sister didn't die. Somebody asked me the other day, do you talk to anybody else about Brian and Robin? And I was like, wow, they live in my office. Brian and Robin are 2 firefighters that we lost at a coal rain 11 years ago, which I was nowhere around. But I still work through Brian and Robin. It's like a phrase, Brian and Robin. And one guy asked that. And I'm like, so many. Because I see people all over the tri-state area, I'll hear, oh yeah, I was in Patrick's recruitment class. Oh, Patrick was my friend before we even got in the fire service. I got Patrick hired. I gave him a recommendation. I told him to take the job. I worked with him here. I worked with him there. All of it is so, for lack of a better word, incestuous. It's like bad Kevin Bacon, less than 6 degrees. Everybody knows everybody. And so different people have different experiences with this. And what it typically causes is isolation. And how this usually works is, and Ian might be able to speak to this because you were at Liberty at the time, but when I first got on, I was one of the first people to get the NIOSH report. They sent it to me ahead of time because they knew there would probably be fallout, right? So I read it, and I go on. I do not remember reading anything about mutual aid. Nothing. I never heard anyone speak of mutual aid on that run. It was Hamilton. And then it was the Fives. And then it was this shift. And then it was, he was in my seat, like Callahan. And then it was, I was off that day and I was supposed to be working, which wasn't just Callahan. And it just kept getting smaller and smaller And the answer to all of that was, well, nobody understands. Nobody can understand. It's not worth talking about because nobody else gets it. And so I had all of these people that were suffering individually and collectively, but they didn't talk really about it to each other because their experience in their mind was so unique. And then I go train Liberty. And I think before I trained them, I started seeing people from Liberty. And that was the first time I even knew that there was anybody else on that fire, which now makes sense. Of course you're going to have mutual aid or fire that size. But I didn't realize that there were firefighters left out hanging that were struggling because of Patrick. Because nobody ever acknowledged it. Because all we ever talked about was no one else gets it. And the world just kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And what we really needed to be doing was expanding it and including. Because there's guys that come see me that were not mutual aid and are not part of Hamilton. And they're like, I knew Patrick, we were friends. It messed me up. I wouldn't have known about that guy, right? And if they're coming to me 3 years after Patrick's died, oh my God, that's a lot of suffering that wasn't necessary, right? So we need to be expanding. So with those 24-hour shifts and demanding lives, that other 48, especially if you're working 48 or 72, do you guys have a legal limit that you can't work more than 72?
We don't do more than 36 straight.
36 straight, okay. So that idea is that, yes, it may feel normal, but guess what? It's because you've set a new homeostasis. Your tolerance has been built like this job is alcohol. And you think you can handle more and more and more and more. Has anybody did a DUI run, crash, car, drunk driver? Yeah, that guy probably thought very similarly to the way you think about your trauma. I can handle it, I'm fine. I feel fine, I look fine. And the rest of us are all outside saying, give us your keys. This is not safe. But because you guys are in that fishbowl, and you bounce it off each other, of course we're struggling. It's ugly, it's bad. So the vagus nerve, it's the 12th or the 10th cranial nerve. It starts in your brain and it goes to your colon. So when we see people with problems with IBS or gastrointestinal, it's literally hitting all the way through your body. So it hits almost every major organ. Your lungs, your heart, your stomach, your liver, your spleen, your colon, and other parts in your abdominal cavity. And it's linked to your digestive, circulatory, respiratory, endocrine system, immune system, and your renal systems. And it's literally the center to the parasympathetic nervous system. And so a lot of times we do interventions that don't include talking about feelings, where we're just regulating that vagus nerve. Because sometimes I don't even need anyone to tell me what they're upset about. If I can help them learn how to restore parasympathetic dominance, you don't have to talk about shit. You don't have to rehash it. We don't do exposure therapy. We don't do narrative therapy. You don't have to talk about your feelings. If I can get you to restore parasympathetic dominance, we don't need to talk about stuff. And then sometimes it really is important to find out what words are going to help express that. And then other times I'm just like a neutral party. It's not your wife, not your mom. And you're like, my clients will be like, okay, here's this screenshot of a text message between me and my wife. You tell me what's going on here. I don't have a dog in the fight. So I can see things a little bit clearly that other people can't because they have a vested interest, right? Sometimes that's my only job, is just being a neutral party. But that vagus nerve, if we can regulate it, it's fantastic. If it's dysregulated, you're going to have all kinds of problems. So a lot of times, I will literally have somebody sit in my office and tap on their collarbone. If you ever heard of EFT, emotional freedom technique, or tapping, this is where my vagus nerve runs through. And I can feel it shift. I can actually feel, just from restoring that regulation, that it changes my whole entire body, right? So, the iliopsoas muscle. Again, this is not about moral failing, character, beliefs, nothing. What this is, you know those roly-poly bugs that are like, you touch them and they curl? So your iliopsoas muscle is like your roly-poly bug. and it is literally built to protect our underbellies. So if we're playing around and you go to throw a punch, you've probably done it, first thing I'll do is this, right? So that muscle connects from our spine all the way down to our leg. So it's our fight muscle and it's our flight muscle. It's essential. And it's like the trauma mom, it holds it all, right? And it makes sense, right? Because if I'm gonna, if you hit me in the back, it's gonna hurt. But nobody goes like this to get, to protect themselves. We always go like this. And that's what that muscle is meant to do. It's meant to throw us into the fetal position, but it also holds all of our emotional stress. And so releasing that psoas often brings up old emotions that were deeply stored in the tissue. It also allows a sense of safety to be felt in the body and give the system permission to unravel. And so I do something called TRE, which is trauma or tension release exercises. They now do it every shift, not every shift, but every third shift, because there's a crew that does it at Liberty, where the actual lieutenant organizes it. And we call it number 7, and they get down on the floor, and they do this exercise that I taught them. I'm going to go do a DIY mental health up in my home county next month. And part of that is, if a lot of what I do, like there's 167 hours that you are not going to be in my office. And if all you do is come in and dump into a puke bucket named Cinnamon, and then you go back out and you have no other skills to handle the rest of the week, shit's going to bother you the same and you're not going to get better. But if I can give you tools to use during those 167 hours, then we can make some progress. So a lot of what I do is teaching how to manage your body, right? So if we can, and I've got, the first time I'll get a guy on the floor, and they think they're cool and they're laughing and it's awkward and they're laying on Cinnamon's floor on a yoga mat and yoga's for pussies and they're giggling and then I get them doing it and their legs start trembling. It's like we open a valve and your legs start trembling. And then all of a sudden the giggles get nervous and awkward and then they just melt like an ice cube. Because we can get rid of some of that trapped emotion in their body, which sounds all woo-woo. I get it, like, oh, you're gonna release trauma from my body. But literally, that is what our bodies are built for. We have 2 nervous systems working together. On, off. So if we don't acknowledge that there's ways to get it out other than 1, talking about it, they'll love to talk, or 2, that you're just gonna be okay. I had somebody say to me, well, my wife was sexually abused when she was little. And I was like, well, there's a good chance she has PTSD. Well, the answer was, but that was when she was little. She still has it? I'm like, if she didn't get treatment, would she still have cancer? The idea that just because it was a long time ago that it just goes away. Not necessarily. So what's actually happening in our mind, that cognitive response? So keep separate. Brain neuropsychology, like the actual organs, the pieces and the parts. Mind is more thoughts. So now we're actually looking at how we think, not what's happening in our brain. Right? So the main addiction is to me, myself, and I, that we basically are addicted to wanting to protect ourselves. Right? So that's what trauma looks like. Right? It's just like basic human nature, right? Like I don't want hurt, I don't want emotionally hurt, and I don't physically hurt. But once there's been trauma, we get addicted to the idea of self-protection. So, I don't even know what I'm looking at. So, areas of cognitive psychology, it includes the activities and processes concerned with the acquisition, storage, retrieval, and processing of knowledge. In other words, it might include the process that helps us perceive, attend, remember, categorize, think, decide, and so on. So remember, all those things that are happening in your prefrontal cortex aren't happening when you're triggered or during a traumatic event. So what are cognitive distortions? So in CBT, or TF-CBT, which is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the primary evidence-based intervention that's endorsed by the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation. Cognitive behavioral therapy is based on a set of cognitive distortions that are explained as biased and irrational. That's how they explain these. They will also tell you that they are human nature, that we all think like this. But doing this work, what I've come to understand, especially when you constantly are working in trauma response or just emergency response in general, is that we train you. When I say we, I mean you. You train yourself, you get trained on how to be prepared for any circumstance that many of you may not see in your fire service career, right? Like, you may not have that experience, but you know what to do in that situation, right? That is actually, over here in non-fire service, non-emergency response world, is a cognitive distortion. It's problematic. It's called catastrophication. So we ask you to think like this when you're on duty, and then we ask you to make a smooth transition when you're not, but we don't tell you that, right? And in fact, when I was in North Carolina, I read their State Highway Patrol's motto, and I don't know if it says this anywhere else, but that's just where I read it. And it said, even when we're not on duty, we're on duty. And I was like, jeez, what is that ingraining? Nothing but hypervigilance, right? You always got to be on the lookout. I asked who goes into a restaurant and doesn't look for the exit sign for the fire exit or smoke detectors, right? I even do it now. I am so not a firefighter. But because of working with you all, it starts to develop those habits where I'm like, okay, how do I get out, right? Because I hear about those things. I hear about the emergencies, and so then I start to get prepared for them. But they're not irrational, right? They can't be irrational. You're trained to do it. But so as the observer, maybe I could say, well, that's irrational, that every time you go into a restaurant, before you can sit down, you have to look for all the exits, all the smoke detectors, and then you'll never have your back to the door? What if that's the only seat left? You're not going to go to that restaurant? Seems irrational, right? But when you are the participant, when you're the person that's in that seat, that's doing those things, it's just self-protective. This is how we stay safe. Last night I came home from Hamilton, and I needed to get dinner started and the dog's out. And I ideally wanted to do it before my partner got home from golf. And I thought, I'll get dinner started, then I'll get the dogs, because the dogs are work, they have a routine, there's certain things that they have to do before they'll come back in. Well, that was a great idea until I was standing outside with my pug, who is a meanderer, and I was obsessing on the space between the top of the curtain and the top of the window, because I had a skillet on the stove. And my poor dog didn't even get to poop. He got yanked in the house because all I could think of was, and all I was watching for, was flames shooting above that curtain. I was terrified I was going to set my the kitchen on fire. And part of it was because I knew I had about 105 guys that would be like, Cinnamon, what were you thinking? Have we not taught you any better than to leave something on the stove? But it got to the point where I couldn't even stay outside anymore. So in that mind, it looks irrational, right? Like, come on, Cinnamon, is your house really going to catch on fire? But what's your answer? It could, right? How many kitchen fires have you been on that it was just stupidity, negligence, right? So the likelihood of that happening, slim to none. My house is fine. But when you've seen that, you're like, why? Why take the risk, right? So it's self-protective. But when we're in situations that don't require it, it actually can be self-sabotaging. So cognitive distortions, splitting or polarized thinking. Our brains like that story, safe, unsafe. If it's unsafe, then we gotta be prepared for it. In you guys' work, it makes absolute sense that you just pick a way and you go, and if that doesn't work, then you pick another way. But sitting around going, well, what do you think? Well, what do you think? Well, you've been through this before, what do you think? Shit's gonna burn down and people are gonna die. So you just act based on all that training. So that polarized thinking, again, is part of your job. And we're asking you to leave your job and go function in the world, and then we're going to call it a distortion. And that is a really hard switch to flip off, because this is just an extension of your fight or flight system. This is just how your mind's working. Yeah, budding. This is one of my favorites, right? This is a classic Midwestern woman. When you're like, oh, I love your dress, and you're like, oh, this old thing, right? Like absolutely minimizing, not being able to take a compliment, focusing on the negatives, ignoring or diminishing the positives, or insisting that the positives don't count. Well, this officer did this, and this was my, well, yeah, but he did all of this too, right? Like not being able to acknowledge that. Overgeneralizing to come to a general conclusion based on one or a few incidents or pieces of evidence, right? So the idea that if you're union, you're bad. If you're not union, you're bad. If you're, I've watched this weird love-hate relationship between police and firefighters. If you're a police officer, you're bad. And if you're a police officer, then you're saying the firefighters are bad. So mind reading, without the individual saying so, claiming to know what somebody else's motives or intentions were. I know why he did that. And you know what usually follows that? Because he's just trying to be a dick. Right? Like, we never assume somebody's doing something out of niceties. Right? It always is default. Because here's the thing. If I assume that you're doing something maliciously, I'm safe, I'm protected. I can always find out that you weren't, and then, well, good, no harm, right? But if I assume you were doing something good and you were actually being malicious, guess what? That's going to trigger my hypervigilance because I'm not going to see that 2x4 coming from, and it's just going to hit me upside the head. And that's when we start developing that ability to mind read and catastrophize, right? So if I can plan and predict and expect the worst case scenario and sit and over it, ruminate, then I will at least be protected. You can't hit me with that 2x4 if I'm ready to put my arms up. But if I'm assuming good, and I'm just like, blah, 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 and then I get hit upside the head, that's hurt me once, shame on you. Hurt me twice, shame on me. Right? So we actually ingrain this in ourselves. And then catastrophizing, again, it's your job. Right? And then we jump off duty, and it's a distortion. So being able to make that transition. So this is why we talk about it's not an abnormal response. In fact, this is a very normal response to an abnormal situation, which your job is an abnormal situation. That's why you have a job. So the rest of us don't have to. Right? And then magnifying and minimizing. This is when something that's actually a big deal, we downplay. And something that's not a big deal, we use that as an excuse to explode. Right? So let's say bald. Mullet boy. Right? Yeah. That video recording. Every time. So let's say you make fun of me at the kitchen table. And I'm not going to tell you that it hurt my feelings, because what's that going to do? If I tell him that what he said upset me, what do you think is going to happen?
Get a Wendy's application.
Get a Wendy's application? Or now, like, I literally told him where the chink in my armor is. I gave him ammunition to come at me, right? So instead, maybe, like, I wait a minute, and I just, like, walk by him and ignore him or give him a shady look, maybe bump his shoulder, and then maybe Ball's like, hey, you guys know what's wrong with Cinnamon? She's like, something's wrong. No, we don't know. Well, I'm just going to give her space today. I'm not going to mouth off any more to her. Right? So inevitably, I did exactly what I had to do without being vulnerable. Or maybe we go into the next room, and I see that he took my pen off the medic. And that's my favorite pen. And I'm going to call him every name in the book, and I'm going to yank it out of his shirt, and I'm going to tell him not to touch my shit ever again, or I'll kill him. Now, that's what we call magnification, because it's a big pen. You can buy them in bulk for like 7 cents a piece. But if I can't say, you hurt my feelings and you embarrassed me in front of my crew, you better believe I'm going to find another way to get that anger and frustration out, even if it's over a 7-cent big pen. Blaming. So you know how I talked about putting the onus on the wrong people when things go wrong. We also had people that blamed themselves solely. And then Callahan probably told you that he blamed Patrick. He was mad at Patrick because he thought he must have done something stupid, or was being irresponsible, or it was because he was too new and he didn't know enough. But that was part of his PTSD, was blaming the guy who died for his own death in that particular situation, even though we had 2 guys sitting in prison. And other people were blaming themselves, and other people were blaming an entire city. But we just see how the blame, and really at the end of the day, if you're going to place blame, it's who got the guilty verdict. So shoulding, this was my favorite. So criticizing oneself or others that you shouldn't, or should, or you must, or you ought, or you have to. So similar to the fallacy of fairness, This pertains to an ironclad list of rules about how you and others should act, how things should go, and how things should be. I kind of think of this as like stopping in the middle of a race and complaining when you catch your toe on the hurdle. Everybody else keeps running, and you're over there like stewing about your training schedule and how you didn't kick up high enough. The race is going on, but we're stuck back here shadowboxing reality. Move your feet. The race didn't stop, right? So shooting is actually a waste of time, and it's a distraction. So guilt versus shame. So guilt is I made a mistake, I did something wrong. Shame is I am something wrong. And shame comes in when it comes to stigma. Because if everybody worries, or if everybody thinks that I'm morally bankrupt, that I need to go to Fashion Bug or to Wendy's, if I can't do this, that's different than like I'm having a reaction. Or I did something, but now it's like, oh, they're not trustworthy, right? They're not capable. I'm so stupid. Personalizing, thinking that everything others do or say is a direct personal reaction to you, and additionally comparing yourselves to others and trying to determine who's better or worse. So personalizing is that guy that walks in the room when everybody's laughing and then stops, because we stop and we like look to see who comes in the door, and they immediately think that we're talking about them. And guess what? Sometimes we are, but sometimes we're not. And that's where the personalizing comes in. And that's why it gets tricky with wisdom. Guess what? What if I've been sitting at that table before when people were bad-mouthing other people? I know what happens at that kitchen table. So when I walk in and the conversation stops, my first thought is, what happened that they could be talking about me? Right? And emotional reasoning. This is why I don't go to the gym, because I don't feel like it. So emotional reasoning is coming from that place that when how you are feeling, it dictates what you do and what you believe. Right? So the idea that I'm pissed off at Ball, and so therefore Ball intentionally tried to piss me off. You're wrong, you did it on purpose because I'm mad. I wouldn't be mad if you didn't do it on purpose. Or maybe we just say, I don't care that you didn't mean to. I don't believe you, or it doesn't matter because I'm mad. Right? So that's emotional reasoning. So our fallacies, control. If I control everything, I always say, and my clients kind of look at me with this like look in their eye until they figure out what I'm saying. The best cure to anxiety is control. Because if everything goes exactly the way that I want it, I got nothing to worry about. And that's what anxiety is. Chronic worry, in a nutshell. Right? So if I can just control everything, if everything goes my way, anxiety's gone. But the reality is that that is not how this world works. We don't control anything. But what we do see is people getting really angry when it goes off path, right? That irritability and aggressiveness, verbal aggressiveness, and sometimes physical too. Have to or can't. So mislabeling a choice as something one has to or can't, rather than recognizing the behavior as avoidance of the consequences of not doing X. This comes up in trauma saying, I can't talk about it. Perhaps, but also maybe you've already weighed out your options and you're afraid of what will happen as a consequence of talking about it, so you just choose not to, which is fine. Let's call a spade a spade. It's always a choice, right? I mean, I could have chose not to come here today, but guess what my consequences was going to be? I get a reputation for somebody that doesn't show up and I wouldn't get paid. Right? So I may say, I have to go to Dayton today, but the reality is that that's not true. I chose to come to Dayton today because the consequences of not doing that are greater than what I want to experience. So fallacy of change, believing that because one's happiness or success depends on others changing their will, an effort or belief that if pressured enough, people will change to suit them. If you just do what I want you to do, we will all be happy. Right? And if I just goad you, right? I hear people with anxiety or depression, specifically depression, where they say, my family member just constantly says that I'm just lazy, and I just need to get up and do something. Right? Oh, so close.
Yeah, I'm not.
And it's that idea that if I just insult and push you enough, that you will be motivated. I had a high school basketball coach like that, who just insult the crap out of us thinking that it was gonna motivate us to like prove him wrong. I quit. I didn't play ball my senior year because I don't like to be talked to like that. Fallacy of fairness and heaven's reward kind of go together. Good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. We figure out, and especially in the fire service, that is not true. You see too many people that are good, considered good, that will have terrible things happen to them. And then fallacy of fairness. Whose mother told them life's not fair when they would be like, that's not fair? Some of us adults are still hanging on to that. So emotive reactivity. The emotional and behavioral responses. So this is actually what people come to see me for, because they don't know about the rest. They come and see me and say, I exploded on my kid. My wife and I are getting a divorce. She is really mad at me. I'm not getting along with my coworkers. I am tired. I had an old client ask to come back today, and their response was, I'm just tired. I'm so exhausted, right? So emotion dysregulation. That emotional response is poorly modulated and doesn't fall within the conventional range of accepted or appropriate emotive responses. Let's just sum that up with an explosion, right? Like when I verbally explode on somebody. It can look like angry outbursts or behavior outbursts, and it can cause problems with a person's social interactions and relationships at home or places of employment. There are tons of movies that do this, right? When they have somebody explode or react, and then the rest of the characters are like watching on, and they're embarrassed, and they say they're sorry, and they run out of a room, right? It's a very classic movie scene. That is emotion dysregulation. And when chronic trauma has occurred, remember, chronic, right? Like it doesn't have to be like the critical incident. It can simply be the accumulation of critical incidents. It starts, the hypersensitivity to emotional stimuli causes a slower return back to the normal state. So let's say that I walked in, I think you're talking about me, I get mad, and it takes me all day to feel better. I come back in next shift and maybe you guys are worried about my mood. And I'm like, hey, what's up? I'm fine. I don't even remember. But because it takes so long for me to regulate again, it's not necessarily because I'm actually still mad. It just takes me a while to get my balance back. So when we say that we're angry, this is usually what we feel. But we don't typically have a wide vocabulary when it comes to emotions. So we just say, I'm mad, I'm pissed, I'm angry. And I gave you an example with ball. Why I'm not going to say you embarrass me, right? That shows weakness, and that gives you ammunition. It's telling you exactly where the chink in my armor is. So what I have seen is people feel offended, attacked, depressed, guilty, hurt, distrustful, frustrated, feeling rejected, worried, disrespected. All of these things that like make a huge difference. But these are not typically, let's be honest, words guys use. Right? Like these are vulnerable words that we save for our closest inner circle. We don't talk about like this on the wrist.
Same match, 33. It's the same house, same place. Yeah.
So when I learned about the Social Engagement Center and what we call biological rudeness, I was so relieved because I now had an explanation for the asshole. Right? So there's actually a system in our body that's based on polyvagal theory that starts with our cortex and our brainstem and goes all the way out to our environment. So think like larynx to cortex and then what we see. And so what ends up happening is I'm expecting reciprocity. If I walk in a room and I'm like, hey, Bob, and you're like, hey, what's up? That throws me off because I was expecting, hey, Cinnamon. I was expecting that same level back. And if I don't get the reciprocity, then my body immediately shifts. It's like getting hit with a 2x4. And now my personal narrative becomes I'm offended. It was personal. You targeted me. And now I'm going to behave aggressively. You're like, what's your problem? Right? It's always interesting to figure out who are the people who say, hey, are you okay? They're like, what's wrong with you? Right? The second one is biological rudeness. Because I'm responding to a lack of reciprocity. And if I can override that and say, man, are you doing okay? Right? Because I didn't make it personal. So our brain is constantly detecting through our senses, ears, eyes, nose, everything. And so this is part of it, all the way, like anything that you would use to read another human being, or an animal, sure, eyes, everything. So what happens when we're just going about our day-to-day? This whole thing, right? So something happens, we have a thought or an interpretation about it, then we get a feeling, like now I'm mad, right? I don't like driving in the rain, I hate rain. When it rains, I immediately think, oh my gosh, this is so unsafe. And I get mad and I don't want to do anything. And then I get mad at the other drivers on the road, right? So my physical response is I get the Boston Marathon in my blood. And then maybe like I want to like slam my car into some car and tell get away from me, it's too close, right? But I don't do that, even though I end up just complaining loudly in my car. But now what's happened is, I'll tell you the truth, I hydroplaned in the very first car I ever bought, and I totaled it. And so I hate driving in rain. That's my vulnerability. Vulnerabilities are anything and everything that's happened up until this moment when the activating event happened. So that doesn't matter if it's me hydroplaning in my car in like mid-2000s, Uncle Joe touching me when I was little, or if it was I didn't eat breakfast or sleep last night very well. That's what a vulnerability is. So they are huge. They can be anything. And that's going to impact, right? Because if you ask my mom about rain, I'm a farm kid. So she loves rain. Oh, the flowers and the grass need it. And she will just grab a book and have a great day. Where me, I'm like an anxious mess because I hate it. Now what happens when we're triggered? Remember when I said the building would get shelled or if the building was bombed, like we would just take off? Well, there's a reason why it's this short. Because I really probably could find a red button on here. But what happens is that our brains are literally built to bypass that prefrontal cortex and go straight to action. Because the same way that you guys don't take time to look at shades of gray or discuss options, that's why you're trained to just act, is because we're bypassing the whole conversation about what we should do, and you just move. Because if this building started getting bombed, you better believe that we would not be standing around going, what do we do? We're going to be in the parking lot. I'm going to follow you because I'm going to assume you know how to get out of here. But that's why it's actually shorter. Same reason I dropped to the ground that day. I didn't need to sit and think about whether or not I should stay standing or get down on the ground. My body thought it was under attack. I thought it was dying. And so I took action. That's the exaggerated startle reflex. Well, that's fun. I couldn't even tell you. It's probably not nearly as important as long as you keep secrets and suppress information, you are fundamentally at war with yourself. The critical issue is allowing yourself to know what you know, and that takes an enormous amount of courage. So, treatment, resiliency, and post-traumatic growth. These are the goals. If you come to my office, this is what we're trying to do. Right? We're trying to normalize symptoms, recognize that you're having a human experience. Psychoeducation around the brain, body, and the stress. That's what we covered today. We just go into it in greater detail. Increase your awareness and felt tension in your body. We're going to get your interoception center back. Learn self-regulation skills. We're going to get that cingulate regulated. Recognize and clarify perceptions. I'm going to challenge you on cognitive distortions. And that is why it's on the list like halfway down. Because it feels like I'm telling you you're wrong. I had a guy who said, he called me one day, I was driving on 75 and he texted me and he said, can you talk? And I had my earbuds in and I called him and he was so upset he had a PED code. And he said, kids shouldn't die. And I've been working with this guy for a little while. So I could go out on a limb and say, says who? Says who? And he goes, well, I guess me. Like, it sucks. And I was like, how about we stop talking about what should or shouldn't happen and we talk about how hurtful it was to watch that and how traumatic it was to watch that. But he wants to argue reality. And I'm like, let's move that out of the way. You have 2 little kids and it messed you up to watch that. It messed you up to not be able to save that kid. That we can talk about. That we can do something about. I can't do anything if we're going to argue like little kids shouldn't die. Because in fact, they do every day. And that seems like we're stopping on the track when our foot gets caught on the hurdle. So prepare for a future interaction with triggers that are deliberate and intentional. So choice directed rather than reactive. Guess what? You guys not only fight the bear, but then you actually like get in the ring with the bear. Like you don't run away at the zoo. You like are like, can we get this glass out of the way? There was a bar in Columbus. It's actually the bar that I met my partner. And they used to wrestle bears there back in the 90s. Like they had a bear that you could pay to wrestle. And I really want to find an old picture of that. Because that's your job. You literally, I mean, people run out of burning buildings. And I know that you guys get that you run into them, but like, do you understand that you are working exact opposite to your instinctual survival system? So the fact that you shift into parasympathetic or sympathetic and get stuck there makes perfect sense. But you gotta leave work. And that's when it starts to be a problem. And then we build resiliency. So what's resiliency? Resiliency is not learning to not use italics in another presentation. So all it is the capacity to bounce back. It's like a weeble wobble, right? Weebles wobble but they don't fall down. That's what that is. And here's the thing, trauma is universal and it's unique, right? Everyone's gonna have something traumatic happen to them over their life. Does everybody get PTSD? Absolutely not. But if I'm in the car, in my car wreck, and somebody's sitting beside me, we're not gonna experience that the same. And in fact, I remember when I was 16, I got into a car accident, and I happened to be sitting in the back seat because I was with sisters, and they were fighting that day. It was the curling iron that morning. And we pulled into the intersection, and a car pulled out of a parking spot and hit the street and didn't have a stop sign and T-boned us. And right where they hit is where my leg would have been had everybody been getting along that day. Because we always sat in the front seat of the minivan. One sat in this direction, and one sat in this direction with our leg in between the seat and the door. And that's what would have got crushed. And my girlfriend at the time started freaking out, crying, holding her head. We were 16. She probably didn't even have her license a month. And she went into this whole tirade about how she was a terrible driver, take her keys, take her license. She was hysterical, right? And so the reality is that was a traumatic event for her. Didn't have the coping skills, never had experienced that before. Wasn't traumatic for me. I was in the back seat safely with her sister that she was arguing with. And so we had two totally different experiences in that same car accident. So it is universal. We will all get it, and it is personal. We will not experience it the same way somebody else does. And what's traumatic for me doesn't have to be traumatic for you. Maybe I have a kid and you don't, and it's a PED code, and it messes me up. And you're fine. Like, we get to take that into consideration when we're like, really, that bothered you? Because that ball busting is what keeps the stigma going. As a matter of fact, yes, that messed me up. That was a hard run for me. I can't tell you why, it just was. End of story. So building resiliency, that ability to be able to bounce back. So several additional factors that are associated with it. The capacity to make realistic plans and take steps to carry them out. A positive view of yourself and confidence in your strengths and abilities. Skills in communication and problem solving. The capacity to manage strong feelings and impulses. All of these are factors that people can develop in themselves. But the reason you develop them is because you know you need them. If you don't know you need them because you sit in a station that just says, well, yeah, that's just how it is, then we're not necessarily going to be equipped with this. So post-traumatic growth, what is it? And I'm going fast right now. We're at 33 after. So PTG, post-traumatic growth, not everyone gets PTSD, and not everyone stays in PTSD. PTSD is actually treatable. Jason Callahan is my poster child for post-traumatic growth. If I could build a full, like, building wall mural for post-traumatic growth, it would be him. Because when I met him, Rumspringa was over. He was already a peer support coordinator. And so I only got to hear about, and I mean, even yesterday, just shooting the shit at the fire station, we still talk about stuff that bothers him. But the reality is that he did have spiritual change, right? He has personal strength. You see it. Like, He shows up for people like I'm like, you don't get paid for this. Like, this is extra. It's phenomenal to me what he does. He also can relate to others in a way he certainly couldn't have before. And the one thing he says is that we can be equipped for everything, but we are never equipped for this. When you lose somebody in your own department, or you're present for a line of duty death, that's a whole other ballgame, right? And I will say, if Hamilton ever lost another firefighter, I will be in the circle. I will not be running the circle. I will be in the circle. Because when you get to be a part of it, there's no way to not be affected. And everybody on the outside has a different level of effect, right? Mutual aid. So appreciation for life, or appreciation of life, new possibilities. Jason was going to be a Baptist preacher, right? He was going to go back, no cussing, no drinking, no swearing, no all the dancing, no having fun. But instead he became a peer support. And I am like working on getting him into a social work program, because that's what he's good at. It totally changed his trajectory. But it moves us from a content life through tragedy or struggle and landing us in a happy, purposeful life, right? I thank Patrick every day. He is with me all the time, because without him, I would not be doing this. And that doesn't mean I will find another career in a heartbeat if I could have Patrick back. I never even met the man. But if I could get a do-over, I'd bring him back and I'd go back to working in a clinic. But the reality is that there was a golden nugget in this pile of shit. And that is that I get to do this now. So here's your 4th District Peer Support Team. You actually have some people that are closer. I know this because of zip codes. So Nick's actually Dayton Fire. Rich is in Springfield. Carmen is down the road in Westchester. I have not met her yet, but I hear she's lovely. And then you've got, it's funny, it says Miles up here. I know him as Joe Cook. He is great. He's one of my favorite humans. And then Callahan is like my work husband. And Gorman is actually very available right now because he's on medical leave. So that's your team. And I will tell you that there's a couple people on this list that I go to. When I have a problem, they're who I go to. Not like my therapist, not like, I mean, I do a lot of other things to take care of myself. But if I need a litmus test, it's Callahan and Joe. And that's it. Perfect timing, the alarm's going off. How do we do? 6 minutes. Anybody got any?